so let's jump into tonight's session, Oral History, Memories, Methods, and Technologies. My name is Josiah Schmidt. I am a history and genealogy specialist with the Emerson History and Genealogy Center at St. Louis County Library, and I'm also a PhD candidate at Washington University in St. Louis. And I'm very excited to be here with you all today to give you what I hope will be a 21st century take on how to do oral history for genealogy or for other forms of historic preservation. A take that will be informed by the latest science, the latest technology, and best practices in the oral history field. The fun way to summarize all of that is to say that I hope this program tonight will give you the tools that you need to hack the human brain to do the best oral history that you can do. So here is a brief outline of what we're going to go over tonight. I hope that these principles and strategies that we are going to talk about will be just as applicable if you are doing oral history for a local history project or a history of an organization, a history of a church or other house of worship, or even more academic oral history in an anthropology or sociology or scholarly history setting. Also, the principles and strategies here are what are called best practices. But as I will reiterate again later on in this presentation, if it comes down to doing oral history imperfectly and just getting it done versus trying to do it totally perfectly and never actually getting it done, always err on the side of just doing the oral history interview and getting it done, even if it's imperfect. So things that we're going to talk about tonight include an explanation of how human memory works from a neuroscientific perspective. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of doing oral history. We will discuss equipment and technical considerations. We'll talk about how to initiate contact and build rapport with an interview subject on a person-to-person level. We'll talk about how to structure the interview environment to get the most out of your oral history interview. We'll talk about strategies and structures and styles for oral history questions. And then we'll wrap it all up by getting into some thorny matters of truth and untruth, bias and objectivity, and what that means for us as oral historians. So let's start by explaining what human memory is and how it works. So there are different types of memory. All types of memory are used when doing oral history for genealogy. And the three main categories of human memory are working memory, which is temporary memory for transient information. This is for things you need to remember for, say, the next few minutes, but you don't need to remember maybe a couple of days from now. There's also procedural memory, which is long-term memory responsible for skills, habits, procedures, and actions. We use procedural memory when we remember something like how to unlock our phone or how to drive our car. These are memories that just integrate into our actions in which we don't really explicitly think about. There is also declarative memory, which is long-term memory that is responsible for recalling facts and events. And the three types of declarative memory that we are going to be mainly concerned with in this class are semantic, episodic, and prospective memory. As oral historians, we need prospective memory so that we remember to bring the necessary supplies to the interview, so that we remember to make the necessary preparations, so we remember to actually ask all the interview questions we were hoping to ask. We need semantic memories because we are trying to extract verifiable genealogical facts from our interviewee. and so that we can remember the correct facts to include in our own questioning and prompting of the interview subject. And then we need episodic memories because we are also trying to extract stories and subjective experiences and feelings and emotions from our interviewee so that we can have a richer, more holistic understanding of our family history and of the past in general. So all three of these types of declarative memory are really important for genealogists and historians who want to incorporate oral history as a type of evidence. So let's dig a little deeper into what semantic memory is. Examples of semantic memories are things like, my dad was born in 1923, or our family originally came from Pomerania. Here are some key concepts that pertain to semantic memory. If you have ever had a word or a fact on the tip of your tongue and you just can't remember it, that is called blocking. What's happening there is that there is a blocked or weak connection between a couple of neurons in your brain, which is preventing your brain from accessing a piece of information. When you are able to retrieve and reproduce information directly from a memory, that is called recall. This is like when someone asks you what high school you attended and you simply state the name of the high school. That's recall. When you are able to identify previously encountered information when it is presented to you again, that is called recognition. Let's say someone asks you the name of your first grade teacher, and at first you struggle to remember, but then someone says, wasn't it Mrs. Johnson? And then the neural connection reestablishes, and you say, oh, yeah, that's right, Mrs. Johnson. So that's recognition or recognition. And both recall and recognition are types of retrieval. Retrieval is when you bring information from your long-term memory storage back into your current working memory. So a retrieval cue is a reminder or a prompt that helps a neural connection between long-term memory and working memory be reestablished. The remark, wasn't it Mrs. Johnson, is an example of a retrieval cue. But with retrieval cues, beware of what is known as the ugly sister effect. The ugly sister effect is when the brain, trying to recall a correct memory, accidentally recalls an incorrect memory and thereby establishes and strengthens that incorrect neural pathway, making it harder for you to recall the correct memory in the future. So this phenomenon gets its name from the fairy tale Cinderella, where Prince Charming is trying to get access to the desired person, Cinderella, but Cinderella's ugly stepsisters keep popping up instead. So here's how it works from a human memory perspective. Let's say that you are trying to recall the name of a great aunt that you met when you were a child, and her name was Lorraine. In trying to remember the great aunt's name, your brain accidentally connects to the name Loretta. Even though that doesn't feel quite right to you, that neural linkage has now been established. And now, every time you try to think of that great aunt's name, all you're able to think of is the name Loretta. It just keeps popping up in your memory over and over, and you can't get rid of it. And each time you think, great aunt I met as a child, Loretta, the more that neural linkage between those two concepts strengthens, and the more the linkage to the original correct name, Laureen, gets harder to access. So that's the ugly sister effect. And we're going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about how to avoid that and how to work around it. Now let's switch over to the category of memory called episodic memory. An example of an episodic memory is, I remember immigrating to America with my parents, and I can tell you what happened, and I can tell you what it was like, et cetera, et cetera. And then you launch into a narrative of your immigration experience. That is an episodic memory. You're recalling an episode, like an episode of a TV show. Episodic memories are memories of events or episodes that happened to us. Our brain creates episodic memories when we pay attention to something. So, how many of you have ever realized that you don't remember where you set your keys or your phone or your glasses down? That problem occurred not because you have early onset Alzheimer's, but rather because you simply weren't paying attention when you set it down. If, when you set an object down, you make a point to pause and think about the fact that you're setting it down in that spot, and maybe even say to yourself out loud, I am setting my keys down in this location because dot, 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 then you will be highly unlikely to forget where your glasses are when you go back to pick them up again later. All episodic memories are subject to degradation over time, however. Some episodic memories degrade at different rates than others. Certain episodic memories you can remember vividly all of your life. For other episodic memories, you might today have a clear memory of a meal that you had with a friend 6 months ago, but in 2 more years, that memory may be irretrievable. Other episodic memories might have even shorter lifespans. You might today have a clear memory of the details of a conversation you had at work last week, but in a couple more weeks, that memory may be irretrievable. What's going on here are a couple of neurological phenomena at work. One is called the recency effect, which refers to the ready availability of episodic memories from the last year or two. The other is called the reminiscence bump, which refers to the heightened availability of episodic memories from ages 15 to roughly 30, 15 years old to roughly 30 years old. Scientists aren't totally sure why the reminiscence bump happens, but they suspect it's because ages 15 through 30 is the time in our lives when we experience so many memorable firsts. The first time you fill in the blank. A lot of that stuff happens between ages 15 and 30. Some ways that episodic memories tend to stick are if they are flashbulb memories, which are a type of episodic memory that is vivid, detailed, emotionally intense. Flashbulb memories are created when you experience a significant or emotional event. An example of a flashbulb memory is remembering where you were when you heard that JFK had been shot, or remembering where you were when you found out that 9/11 was happening. A memory can also have significance when, like we just mentioned a minute ago, it is the first time something ever happened to you. So, to illustrate the next concept, we are going to do a little exercise. On the next slide, you are going to keep your eyes wide open and you are going to watch a series of images flash in front of your eyes. And then I'm going to ask you a question about what you just saw. Ready? Okay, so which image stayed on the screen slightly longer than all of the rest of the images? Most of you are probably saying the big black and red flower. Actually, if you were to time that out, every one of those images stayed on the screen for the exact same amount of time, 0.2 seconds. But the reason that that flower appeared to stay on the screen a little bit longer than all of the shoes was due to a phenomenon known as the temporal oddball effect, which is in turn part of a larger phenomenon called the mental time dilation effect. So events that take us by surprise or expose us to something new often trigger the so-called mental time dilation effect, wherein time actually seems to move more slowly during novel experiences. This is happening because the brain is processing information faster when it's perceiving something new or unexpected. And so your perception is benefiting from a higher resolution during that time, so to speak. So during these novel events, it feels like our brain suddenly has more time to slow down and process the event, thereby hanging on to a more detailed and tenacious memory of it. Now, surprising or emotionally charged events are not the only memories that can stick. Less emotional or jarring episodic memories can also stick when those memories fit into what is called a schema. A schema is a pattern of thought or a system for organizing and perceiving new information. In other words, episodic memories tend to stick when they reinforce notions that we already have of ourselves. For example, optimistic or confident people tend to remember their successes and their good fortunes better, while pessimistic or dour people tend to remember their tragedies and their failures better. Every once in a while, however, a small handful of episodic memories can stick when they contradict your schema in a really striking way. For instance, if you believe that you are generally a kind and empathetic person, you might remember a lot of times that you went out of your way to be kind or empathetic to someone, but you might also have one or two nagging memories that stick in the back of your brain about the one or two times that you were especially unkind to someone. Or vice versa. You might feel like you are a grumpy person by nature, and you might be able to recall a lot of times that you snapped at someone or you got the better of someone. But you might also have a couple of particularly stark memories of times that you did something especially kind or selfless. So, how do we know that episodic memories are being processed in a different part of the brain from semantic memories and prospective memories? How do we know that episodic memories, memories of an episode or an experience, aren't just bigger or longer versions of semantic memories, memories in which we can recall a single fact? Well, we know this because there are a small number of people in the world with a disorder called hyperthymestic syndrome, also known as highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. People with HSAM remember everything that ever happened to them at every moment of their lives in great detail. They can recall every single meal they ever ate, every single conversation they ever had, word for word, and so on. However, what researchers have found is that these people with HSAM who have perfect episodic memory are just as forgetful as the average human being when it comes to recalling semantic memories or prospective memories. So HSAM individuals are just as prone as you or I to forgetting the capital of Minnesota or forgetting to bring their car keys when they walk out the front door. Scientists still aren't totally sure what causes HSAM, but they have noticed that people with HSAM have something like 9 areas of the brain that are enlarged. And what's even more interesting is that people with HSAM report that they suffer as a result of remembering every single episode. They report that it's harder for them to sift through all of their memories and pick out the important ones. It's harder for them to tell a story. They report that they go through life feeling constantly exhausted by remembering everything that happened. So forgetting seems to actually serve a beneficial purpose for humans. It helps us to economize our brain power to focus more on the important memories. Sometimes when we forget something that we think is important, we feel frustrated that we forgot it. But we have to remember that our brain is, on the whole, actually doing us a favor. So that was an overview of the structure of human memory. Now let's talk about the fundamentals of doing oral history. How do we apply what we've learned about neuroscience to doing oral history as a genealogist or a historian? There are some fantastic tools out there that many of you have likely heard about, which can help you simplify and jumpstart this process. And these tools are what are known as artificial intelligence or AI platforms. The current best quality and most well-known of these AI platforms include ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and Perplexity. So these mainstream AI tools have very simple, easy to use interfaces, and you can converse with these tools just conversationally, just like you're talking to a real person in what is called natural language. So allow me to take a little detour so that I can show you an example of what this looks like and what you are able to do with tools like this. When you are feeding information to an AI, it is a good idea to not input sensitive information. While your data is reasonably private at the major AI companies, anything that you tell an AI can end up in the AI's training data. So maybe don't give the AI personally identifying information about your interview subject, like their full name, their address, their precise date of birth, their mother's maiden name, etc. But here's an example of a message that you can give to an AI like ChatGPT. When you send a message to an AI to get it to give you a response, that is called giving the AI a prompt. This prompt says, pretend you are a genealogist and oral historian. You are preparing to interview an 85-year-old Jewish woman who immigrated from Latvia in 1949. She settled in St. Louis with her parents, where she has lived from 1949 onward. What are the most important pieces of historical context that I should be aware of when formulating which questions to ask her? So there was a little bit of engineering that went into this prompt. First, I assigned ChatGPT to take on a role. Then I gave it some specific background information. And then I gave it a defined task. So after submitting this prompt, ChatGPT responds to me with some basic background information about the intersection of Jewish and Latvian history in post-war Europe, some historical information about immigration to the US in the 1940s, historical information about post-war life in St. Louis, Missouri, as well as suggesting some thematic areas that I might explore in an interview with such a person. If I had wanted to, I could have further engineered my prompt by telling ChatGPT what format I wanted its response to be in, or by giving ChatGPT a couple examples of the types of information I would like it to give me. I can then continue my conversation with ChatGPT or any other AI platform, following it up with another prompt that says, please give me an outline of 50 oral history interview questions that I can pose to this interviewee. I'm trying to get her life story and the story of her family. And then ChatGPT responds to me with 50 questions that it organizes into categories like family background and ancestry, childhood during the war, post-war years and emigration, resettlement in St. Louis, adulthood, identity, memory, and legacy. If I had wanted to, I could have specified to ChatGPT other categories that I wanted it to generate questions for, or I could have given it examples of how I wanted the questions to be formatted. I could even respond to this list by telling ChatGPT something like, rewrite these questions to sound more informal and conversational. Or I could say something like, please avoid any questions that broach a certain topic. Okay, so talking about ground rules for preparing, you'll obviously want to do your homework, and AI tools can really help you with that. You'll want to know your equipment thoroughly, so give yourself ample time to practice with your physical equipment and get to know its ins and outs beforehand. Your camera, if you're using any lighting, um, your recorder, basically anything that you're going to use, make sure that you know how to use it. Have a system for making sure that you are ready to go. Don't just rely on your semantic memory or your prospective memory to remind you of everything you need to bring on the day of the interview. Have a prepared checklist. Don't just rely on your semantic or prospective memory to remind you of all the questions you want to ask the interviewee. You can also use AI tools like these over here on the right to help you brainstorm ideas of different things you should remember to prepare or bring for the interview. Prepare an outline or a bank of questions you're hoping to get to. When preparing such a list of questions, it's safer to have too many questions than too few. And once again, like we showed a minute ago, AI tools can be great assistants to help you brainstorm ideas for what questions to ask your interviewee. And always, always keep ethics and best practices in mind. This means always be honest with your interviewee. Always strive to come at the interview from a standpoint of kindness and empathy, and always try to faithfully represent an interviewee's words and not distort their words or take them out of context. Another big consideration you might have to make if this is a larger oral history project is choosing whom to interview. In general, it is recommended to prioritize interviewing older subjects first because we just never know how much time we have left with people. Prioritize more significant interviewees. So if this were, say, an oral history project of business owners from a certain neighborhood, you would want to first interview the business owners who had been pillars of the community for many decades before you interview the business owner who just came into the neighborhood and left after a couple of years. So all of them can be important members of the oral history project, but just prioritize the more significant interviewees. And then prioritize those interviewees who are most likely to cooperate. Rather than wasting too much time banging your head against a wall with a hard to get interviewee, maybe just get the so-called low-hanging fruit first. Next, we need to give some thought to initiating contact with an interviewee and building some rapport with them so that they feel comfortable communicating with you. So when you are initiating contact with an interviewee, state the purpose of the interview and the nature of the project. Explain to the interviewee what will happen with the recordings and the transcripts. Describe any legal release that you may ask the interviewee to sign. And give the interviewee in writing your name, contact information, the purpose of the interview, and the scheduled date, time, and location of the interview. Make sure that they have that in writing. So building rapport is all about breaking the ice and making the interviewee feel comfortable with both you and the process. Although building rapport with an interviewee by conversing politely and jovially before the interview can be helpful, please be super careful about off the record pre-interviews. If you converse too much or too loosely before you actually start recording, your recordings may end up missing out on some great memories or material. Yes, if you get a fantastic answer during your unrecorded pre-interview conversation, you could always ask that question again after the recorder is turned on. But usually, a question asked the second time rarely elicits as satisfying a response as it did the first time. We'll talk about this issue a bit more in depth later on in the program tonight. While we might only have one brief opportunity to conduct an oral history interview with someone, in which case we should seize that opportunity, for interviewees that you have the freedom to interview multiple times, know that it sometimes takes more than one interview just to break the ice and fully establish rapport. Always try to leave the door open for follow-up interviews and make your interviewee aware that multiple sessions is an option that you would like to keep open. Okay, now, what if you are doing a really heavy oral history project and you are interviewing, say, a member of the KKK? Are you required to buddy up to them and stroke their ego as part of the rapport building process? Of course not. When interviewing people that you know are going to be saying morally reprehensible things, you can forego a lot of the rapport building as long as you maintain professionalism. Always remember your etiquette as an oral historian. We, as the interviewer, are a guest, and we should act accordingly. So while the oral history field has some video recording purists and some handwritten note writing purists, I advocate a mixture of both recording the oral history interview on video and writing handwritten notes. The pros of recording the audio and the video are that you will catch nuances that an interviewer may miss. Upon listening to the recording, you may find more material than what you remembered or wrote down. It corrects mistakes that you might have made in your written notes. The recording can help when your handwriting gets sloppy and you can't read what you wrote the next day or the next week or the next year. And having an audio or video recording protects you if your interviewee ever accuses you of misquotation. Okay, now the pros of still also making handwritten notes during an interview, even when you're also running a audio and or video recorder, are handwritten notes help you pay attention and register what the interviewee is saying more concretely in your working memory. And having handwritten notes provides at least a form of backup if, heaven forbid, anything bad happens to your recordings. You drop the video camera and it shatters, or the cassette gets damaged or the digital file gets corrupted. So if you've got the handwritten notes, then worst case scenario, at least you've got that. Okay, equipment and technical considerations for an oral history interview. Make sure batteries for all of your electronic devices are fully charged and power cables are packed. You may even want to bring along your own multi-outlet power strip or surge strip so that when you get to the oral history interview location, you can plug in multiple devices if need be. Maybe you need to plug in a camera and also plug in a ring light and also plug in a phone charger. You never know. So a power strip can be really handy. The worst thing that can happen is that you finish an interview and then you realize the battery in your camera or recorder ran out halfway through the interview and you lost half of the recording. Plan to record audio both from your video camera itself and, if possible, and if your budget allows, also record the audio separately on a lavalier microphone. So a lavalier mic is preferred because you can pin a lavalier mic to the interviewee's lapel or shirt or collar, and you can get really good quality audio that way. But again, having both a video camera recording the video and the audio and an audio recording device attached to a lavalier mic, both running simultaneously, what that does is it ensures, say, if the lavalier microphone glitches or runs out of battery, you've at least also still got the audio recorded on the video camera, or vice versa. And these recommendations get at an acronym that we often use in the world of digital preservation. That acronym is LOCKSS, LOCKSS. It stands for lots of copies keeps stuff safe. The more baskets you can put your eggs into, the less likely it is that you will lose everything. And by different baskets, of course, I mean keeping your data on different devices in different formats, stored in different physical locations, etc. So having a video camera recording your oral history while at the same time an audio recorder connected to a little lavalier mic is also running, while at the same time you're also writing down on a notebook notes of what your interviewee is saying. So you've got multiple different media all recording the interview in different ways, and that just provides you with layers of insurance. Now, when setting up a room for an oral history interview, you will need to give thought as to where to place both people and equipment. The recorder, in this case, maybe a video camera, should ideally not be directly in the line of sight. So if you can imagine a line between yourself, the interviewer, and your subject, the interviewee, try not to have the video camera or the audio recorder directly on that line in between you and your subject. But on the other hand, don't try to hide your recorder, because hiding the recorder can psychologically breed distrust with the interviewee. And also, you want the recorder somewhere where you can glance at it from time to time to make sure that it's actually still recording and that nothing has accidentally knocked the recorder out of position or anything. And to further reduce anxiety about the recording equipment, you might even want to show your interviewee the equipment, show your subject how the device works before you start recording. So just kind of explaining to your subject, here's the video camera, here's how it works. It's going to be pointing at you. I'm going to be able to see you on this little preview screen here. This little red light is going to be flashing that is going to indicate that it's working. Just kind of explaining the equipment to your subject can often alleviate some of the camera shyness or anxiety that your subject might have about being in front of a recorder. If you're using an audio recorder attached to a lavalier mic, The audio recorder should be near the interviewee and ideally should be, like I said, a lavalier mic that is pinned to the interviewee's lapel or collar. If you are using a lavalier mic attached to a cord, have the interviewee thread that cord underneath their shirt so that the cord in the lavalier mic pops out the top of their shirt and then attach it to their lapel or collar. That way the video looks a little more natural and your subject doesn't just have a big black cord draped across the front of their torso. And if you want to make your video look even more professional, position the interviewee so that they are sitting kind of off to one side of the frame, and then position yourself at a slight angle to your interviewee so that in the video, the interviewee is not staring directly into the camera, but they're sort of looking slightly off center toward you. Ideally, you would also bring some kind of extra lighting setup so that you can properly illuminate the interviewee's face. Oftentimes, an indoor room will have just general overhead lighting that kind of gives everything a flat, washed out look. Back in the day, we used to have to lug these big box lights and diffusion lights everywhere if we wanted to do an oral history video recording. But these days, a simple LED ring light will suffice. And you can get those on websites like Amazon for less than $30. You don't want the light to be so harsh on the subject's face that it casts these really dark shadows on every wrinkle and every blemish on their face. But you also don't want to blind the interviewee. So if you're going to have a ring light to kind of illuminate your subject's face, you want the ring light just bright enough that it gives the subject's face some illumination and helps to contrast their face with their slightly darker surroundings. And then also make sure that whatever's going on in the background behind the interviewee is not busy or distracting, so that when viewers are watching the video recording of the interview in the future, they're not constantly looking at the background to the crazy thing that's going on back there. And again, like I said, if you're going to use some lighting, make sure that it's a soft light that just kind of illuminates their face and helps it to pop without casting, big dark shadows over every wrinkle, which is going to make them embarrassed when the video recording comes out. So here's a screenshot of an oral history video recording that I did several years ago. You'll see how the subject is kind of on one side of the frame, but looking towards me, the interviewer, as if she's looking towards the more empty side of the frame. She's not staring directly into the camera. You'll notice in the background, we have lowered some opaque darkening shades in the room so that you get a little bit of depth in the background. It's not just a plain white wall back there, but the darkening shades give the background a sort of blurred and muted feel so that the focus stays on the interviewee in the foreground. And we're using just enough light to illuminate the subject and to make her stand out against the background without casting a gazillion harsh shadows all across her face. And then lastly, you would have to look really closely to notice the lavalier microphone that is pinned to her collar. Like I said before, we had her thread the cord for the microphone down her own sweater so that the cord is not in view draped across the front of her body. And that helps to give the video recording the feel of a more normal conversation. One well-suited place for doing video recorded oral history recordings is our oral history studio here in the History and Genealogy Department at the Clark Family Branch Library. So our oral history studio contains a couch where you can sit and record yourself talking about your own family history or your life story, or you can bring in an older friend or family member and you can interview them on the couch. In front of that sofa is a super simple, easy to use touchscreen TV with a recording program loaded onto it. Here's what that looks like. If you're using our recording program, you would first choose whether to record your story in video format or in audio only format. So you click either the green button or the red button. Then you grant permission to turn on the recording equipment by clicking Allow on the pop-up. And if you granted permission to activate the camera, you will see a live video feed. So the camera is now observing, but not yet recording. So this is when you could take the time to make sure that you are satisfied with your appearance, or that your subject is satisfied with their appearance. When you are ready to begin recording, press the green Start Recording button in the bottom menu tray. Grant your permission to begin recording audio and video by clicking Allow on the pop-up. And you can now record yourself or your interviewee speaking. When you are finished speaking, click the Stop Recording button. Next, click the Save Recording button. A box will pop up on the screen asking you to type in your last name. Once you've done that, you click OK, and your video recording file will save onto the computer's downloads folder because this TV screen setup is attached to a computer on a desk here in the Oral History Studio. On the desktop computer that's next to the touchscreen TV, you're just going to make sure that you move your recording file onto your personal storage device, like a thumb drive or a portable hard drive, which should be represented as the E drive if it's plugged into the computer's USB port. You can either drag and drop or copy and paste it. But please note, when these library computers shut down at the end of the day, all data on the library hard drives will be erased and the computer will be reset to what it looked like at the beginning of the day. So make sure after you do an oral history recording in our studio that you plug in a flash drive into the computer and copy and paste or move your file onto your flash drive before you go. If you want to edit your recording file further, whether trimming it or adjusting audio levels, you can use our free software to do so. So on this computer's desktop are a program called OpenShot, which is for editing video files, and a program called Audacity, which is for editing audio files. So you just double click the icon for the software that you want to use. You select the open or the import options under the software's file drop-down menu. And that is going to bring your recording file into the program so that you can edit it. And if you have any difficulties with following the instruction guidebooks that we have in here for using OpenShot or Audacity, please just ask for assistance from a history and genealogy staff member, and we will be happy to help. You do not need a library card in order to use our oral history recording studio. Anyone can come and use it. But to make sure that the oral history studio is not already being used by somebody else during the time that you're thinking of coming, please make a reservation for the oral history studio ahead of time. You can either call the library to make that reservation, or you can make the reservation yourself by Googling St. Louis County Library Memory Lab and following the instructions to make a reservation for the personal recording service. So our oral history recording studio is called the Personal Recording Studio. For those who cannot make it to the Clark Family Branch to use our oral history lab, we also offer audio recording oral history kits that you can check out, just like you would check out a book. Our oral history kits contain a portable Tascam recorder and a lavalier mic, as well as a memory card and an adapter. The kit also contains a folder with instructions and further resources for conducting oral history interviews. Unlike the oral history recording studio, which anyone can use, if you want to check out a portable oral history recording kit, that you do need a St. Louis County Library card in order to check it out. If you check it out, the loan period is up to 21 days. These checkouts are not renewable, and you can only have one oral history kit checked out at a time, but you are always welcome to reserve another oral history kit after you have returned your current one. Okay, now getting back to talking about interview environment. For the interview location, you will want to do it where an interviewee can be reasonably comfortable. You want them to be able to relax and open up and not feel too out of sorts due to their surrounding. But the number one most comfortable place for them might not be the best place for a recorded interview. So you might have to compromise a little bit. If you can do the interview at home, perhaps at the subject's home, that is great. But any things like the following can potentially ruin a recording if you're trying to do it from their home. Noisy household members, noisy pets, noisy coworkers, ringing phones, a room with excessive echo or reverberation, open windows. If you've got AC units or fans, if there are loud clocks that are chiming, food cooking noises, the clinking of cutlery and glasses, street traffic, the sounds of birds or wildlife, just to name a handful. If you are not sure about whether a location will have these noise issues, you might want to make a visit to the proposed location first to make sure before you agree on that location. Some anthropologists actually find great value in recording the sights and sounds of their subjects' everyday life. They call this the sound environment. That can be very valuable for historians. And if you want, you might ask the interviewee to do a sound recording where you follow them around, recording some of their daily routines and interactions, either at home or at work or when they're out and about. But that sort of sound environment recording should be separate from the actual oral history interview. The oral history interview should be in a location that is conducive to concentrating and getting a good quality recording. If home or workplace is not a suitable location for a recorded interview, there are other places that might work well. One, of course, is the Oral History Studio here in our History and Genealogy Center at the Clark Family Branch Library. But if our oral history studio here at the library were unavailable on the day and the time that you wanted to do an interview, you could also potentially reserve a study room at the library for that purpose. You would just have to bring your own recorder in that case. Outside of libraries, I have also seen meeting rooms that members of the public can use at diverse places like community centers, college campuses, fire stations, casinos, golf clubs. You might just need to ask around and find a place that is sufficiently quiet, clean, handicap accessible if need be, and free or low cost to use. So moving on to question strategy, structure, and style. First things first, some interviewees instinctively view interviews as a test and they get anxious. So you as the interviewer must put the interviewee at ease. To do that, you can work your way through what is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy is a 5-tier model of human needs used in psychology. Needs that are lower in the hierarchy must be satisfied before one can attend to the needs that are higher up. At the bottom of the pyramid are physiological needs: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing. So making sure your interviewee is physically comfortable, doing the interview after they have eaten and not while their stomach is rumbling, making sure you have a bottle of water and a box of tissues on standby, doing the interview in a well-ventilated place with a comfortable climate, doing the interview when the interviewee has gotten a good night's sleep beforehand. These can all help make sure that those physiological needs are met so that the interviewee can use their brain power to focus on higher order things. Then moving up the pyramid, we have safety needs. Make sure you're doing the interview in a place where the interviewee feels safe and can concentrate. Moving up further, we have the love and belonging tier. Try to cultivate a sense of connection with the interviewee. You can also allow them to bring in a friend or a family member if you feel sure that that friend or family member will help put them at ease, and that the friend or family member will not just be disruptive or constantly interrupting or talking over the interviewee. Moving up the pyramid again, we have the esteem tier. Make sure your interviewee feels respected and recognized and capable. They need to feel both that what they have to say matters, and they need to feel that they are capable of giving an interview. Lastly, at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization, which is a really fancy word that we can just use to mean allowing the interviewee to imagine a more idealized version of themselves to strive toward. The interviewee should believe that they, at their best, are sufficiently smart, have a sufficiently keen memory that can remember the things that they need to remember and can remember them in sufficient detail and richness. They need to believe that their brain works well enough to do an interview. And if they believe that, they will strive toward that kind of performance. So think back to how earlier in the presentation we talked about episodic memories fitting in with the schema or the systematized narrative that we have of ourselves. So if you can subtly make your interviewee feel like they are an intelligent person, like they are a person with a good memory, like they are a person with worthwhile things to say, then your subject will be more likely to live up to that narrativized version of themselves, to fit into that schema. All right, now another way you can help put an interviewee at ease is to go back to the recency effect and the reminiscence bump that we talked about earlier. If you will recall, the recency effect is the heightened availability of memories from the past 2 years or so. And the reminiscence bump is the heightened availability of memories between ages 15 to 30. So these can be helpful regions of the memory to start an oral history interview with, because as the easiest regions of memory to recall, they can help put an interviewee at ease about the state of their memory and make your subject feel like this is something they are capable of doing. This is also why it might not be the best idea to start an interview with a question that will cause your subject to have to pause and struggle for a bit, like, tell me your earliest childhood memory. So rather, maybe start your interviewee with, tell me about something that happened, when you were 15 or 20 or 25, or tell me something that happened a year ago or a couple of years ago. And of course, while it may be appropriate in some instances to gently challenge your interviewee and ask them about contradictory claims or evidence, if you think your interviewee might be wrong about something, you never want to come right out the gate with confrontational questions or to make your question seem too abrupt or curt. It will take work and time to build up to more challenging lines of inquiry. If your interviewee becomes emotional, you will need to give them time to regain their composure after becoming emotional. Sometimes emotion can be obscured or lost in translation. So pay attention to things like inflection and body language, and make note of any observations that you notice with this. Sarcasm, for instance, does not translate well on paper. So when you sense something like sarcasm or joking, you might write a note to yourself that you felt the interviewee was employing sarcasm or humor here and was not being literal. Due to observations that you noticed in their inflection or body language. If you detect things like sarcasm, you can also bring it up verbally during the interview so that it gets duly noted. You can say something like, "You were being sarcastic there, right? Can you explain that further?" Ultimately, you as the interviewer must prepare by getting into the mindset to listen carefully, to think deeply about what the interviewee is going to tell you, to commit to allowing the conversation to go where the interviewee wants it to go at the pace that they want it to go. As an oral historian, you are not a hard driving journalist or a cross examiner in a courtroom. You are a guest who is being invited into the autobiographical world of the interviewee. And as an interviewer, if you want to get candid responses, and if you want to prevent stress induced memory retrieval failure, you must drive out fear. You must make sure the interviewee is comfortable. Make sure they understand the nature of the oral history project, that they understand how their answers are going to be used. Make sure that they know that they are making a valuable contribution and that this is not an exam. Do as much as you can to help them feel confident in their own ability to remember. So, as an interviewer, it is incumbent on you to respect the interviewee's opinions within reason. The caveat to that is that you don't have to compromise your own values by pretending to agree with, say, morally reprehensible opinions. Like if you're interviewing a KKK member, for instance, if you need to ask a potentially embarrassing question, one tactic is you can quote some other document or person in the wording of your question, especially if the information pertaining to your question is part of the public record, so that it doesn't seem like an allegation coming directly from you, and so that the question comes across as offering the interviewee a chance for them to tell their side of the story and not as an accusation. Make sure if you are recording via audio and or video to record the essential information verbally. And if you're keeping written notes, write down the essential information as well. The essential information should include things like the full names and any nicknames of both the interviewee and the interviewer, the date, the time, and the location that the interview is happening, what format the interview will be recorded in, whether audio, visual, and or print, any legal restrictions or lack of legal restrictions on the use of the material. And you should know that United States federal law states that an interviewee owns the copyright to any recording of their own words unless and until they sign what is called a deed of gift form or some kind of license agreement that lets them keep the copyright but grants you permission to use it for a specific purpose. So if you are just doing hobby genealogy, having an interviewee sign forms is not really necessary. But if you are doing this oral history for your job, or if you are going to turn this into a book and you're going to sell that book, for instance, then you will need to have your interviewee sign something giving you the rights to the interview or giving you permission to use the interview. Construct meaningful but open-ended questions. So avoid starting with questions that only elicit brief answers, like yes/no questions. Open-ended questions are more likely to start with the words how and why. Narrow questions are more likely to start with who, what, when, or where. Simple yes/no questions can serve a purpose and occasionally clarifying minor points, but it's always preferable to get the interviewee to elaborate and to say more. Another way you can organize questions is through a structure that political journalists and courtroom attorneys call funnel interviewing. In funnel interviewing, you start with a broad question and then follow up with progressively narrower questions. Only ask one question at a time. Don't try to package multiple questions together into a single query. You might consider using what the famous oral historian Charles Morrissey called the two-sentence format, in which the first sentence states the problem and the second sentence poses the question. An example of this would be something like, records show that blank, so can you tell me about how you blank? Your inclusion of historical or factual background can both serve as a retrieval cue for the interviewee, as well as showing the interviewee that you've done your homework and that you will understand the things that they are telling you about. It's important when interviewing someone that you do not interrupt their responses. Let the interviewee fully finish a thought before you offer the next question. Consider what order you want to ask the questions in. Don't be satisfied with a brief answer. Follow up on what you heard. One particularly useful form of retrieval cue you can bring to the interview is a visual aid. This can be anything from photographs to documents to maps to heirlooms. Along the vein of not being satisfied with a brief answer, which we mentioned on the previous slide, another important rule for oral historians is to learn to love the silence. In fact, you should lean into those silences, even if they feel awkward, until you are sure the interviewee is finished answering. Just like the fact that brief answers from the interviewee might be the result of the interviewee's shyness or the interviewee's lack of interest in the question, answers that are too brief might also be due to the interviewer being too quick to jump in with a next question. Many of us, when we were being taught our good listening manners, were taught that active listening is polite and beneficial. Making eye contact with someone when they're talking to you, paying attention to them, asking relevant follow-up questions, smiling and reacting at appropriate moments. However, one active listening technique that many of us, myself included, often use is making audible interjections, saying, mm-hmm, uh-huh, yeah, oh, wow, that's so interesting, things like that. But that doesn't work well for oral history, because when we do that, we are constantly interrupting the interviewee and sprinkling our audio recording with these distracting interjections. And these interjections actually risk muffling or covering up the important things that our interviewee is trying to say. So with active listening in the context of oral history, the more nonverbal, the better. Show the interviewee you are paying attention to them, not by interjecting verbally, but by making eye contact, nodding, having a smile or an appropriate facial expression. This takes some practice to train ourselves to listen silently, but it's so worth it. And then many of us, again, myself included, have an innate nervous anxiety about being too quiet for too long, and we feel a natural need to fill the silence so that we don't feel awkward. However, as oral historians, we need to train ourselves out of this nervous habit. One way to retrain ourselves is through the 10-second rule. Count to 10 in your mind before speaking up with a follow-up question to make sure the interviewee is totally done answering. As the interviewer, your silence is your way of saying, go on, I'm still listening, I'm expecting more. If your interviewee is experiencing blocking, having that tip of the tongue moment we talked about at the beginning of the program, if they flat out can't remember something, be careful about suggesting the answer to them. Remember the ugly sister effect that we talked about earlier. If you suggest something to them, it will create a neural connection in their brain between the question they're trying to answer and the answer that you suggested, even if the answer that you suggested isn't the correct answer. And then the next time they try to recall that information, their brain will be more likely to go to whatever answer you suggested, even if it's not the right answer. Keep in mind that you, as an interviewer, do not have to limit yourself to just asking questions. You can also make statements of fact, concise restatements of what the interviewee has said, brief observations and comments, and in fact, mixing some of these into the conversation can help interviews not sound like cross-examinations in a courtroom. But still, inject these non-questions in moderation so that you don't skew the direction of the interview with your own opinions. On the topic of skewing interviews with your own opinion, we also have to talk about loaded questions and leading questions. These types of questions do not have much use in oral history and should be avoided. A loaded question is a question in which someone can tell from which belief or bias your question is being asked. An example of this would be asking, why was grandma okay with having a child out of wedlock? This assumes that the out of wedlock birth was her choice. A leading question is a question that is designed to produce a response that fits a particular hypothesis. A leading question often begins with something like, wouldn't you say? And this is another area where AI tools can come in handy. You can run your list of questions that you want to ask your interviewee past an AI tool and say, hey, ChatGPT, can you look through this and see if I've accidentally got any loaded questions or leading questions sprinkled in here and help me correct those. And here is the part where I undermine everything I have said in this presentation up until this point. It is better to have an imperfect oral history recording than to not have an oral history recording at all. There's no guarantee of how long your subject has left in this life. So if you have an opportunity to do an oral history interview, but you don't have enough time to make sure that every single little thing is perfect beforehand, just go for it. Just do the oral history interview. And along these lines, do not be too formulaic with your interviews. Be willing to go with the flow. Be willing to see where the conversation takes you. Set out to prioritize listening over speaking. Now, we need to tackle the elephant in the room. How do we balance our need to get the truth with our need to get honest, subjective experience from the subject's point of view? How do we address bias in oral history, whether our own subconscious bias influencing the way we ask questions, or the bias of the interviewee that is putting a slant on their memories? Let's start out by acknowledging that we as oral historians are not just collecting facts, we're trying to capture a moment of memory and motion, a moment of meaning making, a moment of emotional expression. However, as genealogists, which most of us on this webinar probably are, We also want to extract usable, valid information that can either help us meet the genealogical proof standard for us to make an assertion of genealogical fact, or that can help us add richness and context to the names and dates and other raw data points in our family tree. Many of you might already be familiar with the genealogical proof standard, which is a standard developed in the field of professional genealogy that requires assertions of genealogical fact to be backed up with reasonably exhaustive research, accurate source citations, reliably interpreted evidence, adequate handling of contradictory claims or evidence, and conclusions that are soundly and coherently reasoned. So as we discuss issues of truth and bias, let's go back to the topic of the human brain for a minute and talk a bit more about episodic memory and how it works. So for those who prize objectivity above all else, we need to introduce ourselves to some disturbing facts about episodic memory, which should give us a dash of humility in our quest for objective truth. Those disturbing facts are that nascent episodic memories are highly malleable before they are solidified into long-term memory. That even consolidated long-term memories can decay as the neural connections literally retract over time. And that every time an episodic memory is retrieved, it changes a little bit. Every time we tell a story, we tweak it ever so slightly, because the memory has to be reconstructed in the context of the latest narrative. Every time a rememberer retells a memory, the rememberer loses a little bit of the fullness of that memory. This slimmer version of the memory overwrites the previous version of the memory, so that with each retelling of a memory, the memory loses some original detail and may also be supplemented with false information that the rememberer's brain sometimes just makes up. This can also result in a phenomenon called confabulation, when someone else tells you their memory of a certain event and their recollection influences or changes your memory of that event. Our brains have this funny way of adopting other people's memories that they've told us and implanting that memory into our brain as if it were our own memory, which can confuse us later. Brains often invent information or parts of memories so that the memories can feel more complete, so that the narrative feels more pleasing. We as humans are narrative creatures. We like to tell the past as a cohesive story. If there's a gap in a story, our brain is more than happy to hallucinate details to make the story make more sense. Not only are our episodic memories constantly evolving, our opinions and emotional state today color how we remember what happened in the past. When psychologists have asked people who have gone through significant events to describe details of their experience of that event shortly after it occurred, and then psychologists have gone back to those same witnesses many years later, some of those witnesses remember entirely different and contradictory details of that event several years later. Even when they are confronted with the differences in their original account that they gave to the psychologist immediately after the event happened, it does not reconjure the original memory, but rather these witnesses several years after the event will say that they just simply don't remember it that way, that they remember it in their current format. And sometimes they get really disturbed and they say they don't understand why they described the event in the way that they did immediately after the event took place, because they are so confident that the event happened the way they remember it now, several years later. This shows that the memory of events is overwritten and not just obscured. Now, unremembered or forgotten details are not necessarily lost forever. lost details can be re-linked to your memory of an event if something or someone else reminds you. However, after a certain number of rewrites, a memory of a memory or a detail of a memory can be permanently lost to the point where even if someone else offers you a cue, you will not believe it because your current version of the memory has solidified too much. There's a kind of famous story about this of high school students who saw the Space Shuttle Challenger explode on live TV in 1986. These researchers went and interviewed the students immediately after it happened and got their accounts of what they remember of seeing the Challenger explode, where they were, what class they were in, what they were wearing, who they were with. Got that all recorded, went back to those same students several years later, and most of the students remembered entirely different things about that event. They remembered themselves being in a different classroom. Some people remembered themselves not even being in school that day at all. They remembered themselves being with different friends. So the memories evolved and changed to the point where they were almost sometimes unrecognizable from the original memories that were recorded right after the event occurred. Going back to what we mentioned earlier in the presentation, the reason why re-asking the same question often elicits a less satisfying response the second time around is because when we recall a memory, our brain reconstructs it rather than pulling it from a fixed mental file. And each recall can change or simplify the memory slightly. This is a process known as reconsolidation. The first telling of a story often taps into this rich sensory emotional detail, whereas second and subsequent retellings make for more flattened, less spontaneous, more rehearsed versions of the answers. Literally, what's happening in this case is a phenomenon that neuroscientists call repetition suppression. Fewer neurons activate or fire the second time a question is asked, especially in areas like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So, in other words, the first time a story is told, this construction is creative and reflective and engages deep narrative thought. The second time often lacks that energy and becomes a little more scripted. But sometimes re-asking about the same thing does not fall into the repetition suppression trap. Sometimes it actually helps to generate a deeper and better response. And here's the difference between a re-asking that flattens the memory and a re-asking that deepens the memory. First off, if you are going to come back to the same question or the same memory, don't repeat, reframe. Ask it from a new angle, shift the perspective. Second, let adequate time pass. Give space and silence after a meaningful answer before jumping in with a follow-up question. And third, you might even try shifting sensory channels. So if you're going to talk about the same memory a second time, the second time, invite the interviewee to access the memory through different senses like sight or smell or sound or taste or tactile senses. And then, of course, how is always a better question word than why when revisiting a question. And lastly, help the interviewee normalize and come to terms with the fact that memories do change over time and that that's okay. You can ask the interviewee point blank, how has your memory of that moment changed over the years? And while we generally try to avoid accidentally conversing with an interviewee off the record because we don't want to miss out on the vividness of the first time an interviewee recalls a memory, what do we do when an interviewee explicitly requests to stop the recorder so that they can tell you something off the record? Well, if something is unrecorded, it's as good as lost. So instead, you might offer to record it, but keep the recording confidential or embargoed for a certain time or a certain number of years, or offer to let the interviewee review the transcript and request edits. An exception is pausing the recording so that your subject can explain to you why they are hesitant. In similar fashion, oral historians tend to have problems with requests for anonymity because anonymity does not further the goals of oral history very well. So, similar to requests for speaking off the record, we need to politely push back against requests for anonymity. One big exception, however, is when speaking would put an interviewee at risk of physical harm. In that case, anonymity would be called for. But for the most part, some of the big problems with anonymous interviews are that they open up you, the interviewer, to being accused of fabrication or making things up. And also, anonymity can have the psychological effect of relieving an unethical subject from a sense of responsibility. So, if you get a request for an anonymous interview, try using some of the same tactics outlined on the previous slide for dealing with off the record requests. And then, what should you do if you encounter some uncooperativeness with an interviewee during the interview? Keep in mind that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So go back to Maslow's hierarchy, make sure that your interviewee is comfortable and that they feel respected and that you have sufficient rapport with them. That can often help alleviate uncooperativeness. Try to anticipate the different causes of uncooperativeness and develop strategies for dealing with them ahead of time. If in the middle of an interview you sense any bitterness on the part of the interviewee, then just move to a different line of questioning. And before you raise disagreeable questions, ease the interviewee in by talking about areas they enjoy talking about. Sometimes you might get interviewees who are less than truthful. In that case, we should try to understand why. They might be testing you. They might just be making an honest mistake of memory. They might not be able to handle the truth, to quote Jack Nicholson. Some remedies for this are to return to trouble areas later a little more gently, bringing up contradictory claims and seeing how they square those, and maybe even politely citing contradictory evidence and allowing them to kind of figure out the contradiction between those. And then you can also not bring up the contradiction at all and just note the contradictory evidence in your notes. And then you might have interviewees who like to rattle off their rehearsed stories. These rehearsed stories tend to be embellished and curated over time. So don't take rehearsed stories at face value. You might just let the interviewee exhaust their supply of their rehearsed material and then spot the inaccuracies and gently challenge those inaccuracies. And once the rehearsed stories are exhausted, you'll also be more free to take the interviewee down less traveled paths of memories. And there are also demographic considerations that we have to take into account as oral historians. Things like race and gender and age and sexual orientation. So be sensitive to the diversity of experiences. Sometimes when a subject is talking to one interviewer, they may give a different account than when they're talking to a different interviewer. Famous example is when a formerly enslaved woman was being interviewed by the Federal Writers Project twice. Once, this formerly enslaved woman was interviewed by a white interviewer, and she gave this kind of softened version of slavery. And then when she was being interviewed by a Black interviewer, she was much more open and candid and didn't shy away from the disturbing elements. So, how can we work through these kinds of issues? Try to be sensitive to the implications of different experiences, of different social categories. Encourage your interviewees to respond in their own style and language. Address issues that reflect the interviewee's concern rather than your own concern. And don't be satisfied with superficial responses. Always be willing to dig a little bit deeper. Now, what to do at the end of an interview? So you can ask the interviewee a final question that asks them to reflect on their life as a whole. You can ask them to compare recent events with earlier years. Ask them to draw conclusions about major events. Ask them to look ahead to the future. And ask them if there's anything you did not ask about, but which they would like to put into the record. And then once the recording has stopped, remind the interviewee what is going to happen to these records and recordings. Have your interviewee sign a release if necessary. Remind them of just how important their contribution was. Promptly process your recordings. Do not leave them on that flash drive for months or years because you might lose it or the file might get corrupted. You can process your recordings to turn them into text transcripts using AI tools like Otter.ai, Rev.com, or TurboScribe. And in transcripts and questions and recordings, it's helpful to include your questions as well as the answers to tell readers or listeners what questions these answers were in response to. If there are any questions that you think of afterwards, feel free to send us an email at genealogy@slcl.org, and we would be happy to answer your queries. Otherwise, feel free to come on in and visit us at the History and Genealogy Center at the Clark Family Branch Library. Thank you all for your time tonight, and we hope to see you at future presentations.